Hello, and welcome to this conversation with Dr. David Bradshaw, where we will dig into his new volume from IOTA Publications, Divine Energies and Divine Action, Exploring the Essence Energies Distinction. My name is Marika Proctor, and I have the pleasure of hosting this conversation today as one of IOTA's networking coordinators. IOTA, or the International Orthodox Theological Association, seeks to generate and highlight high-quality scholarship in the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox traditions for the benefit of both the Academy and the Church. That's why we're delighted you are taking the time to tune into this conversation today. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our author, Dr. David Bradshaw, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky. He is the author of Aristotle, East and West, Metaphysics and the Division of Christendom, as well as the editor of several other works relating to orthodoxy and philosophy. These include the volumes Philosophical Theology and the Christian Tradition, Russian and Western Perspectives, as well as the volume Natural Theology in the Eastern Orthodox Tradition, which is also from IOTA Publications and edited along with Richard Swinburne. And in case you haven't seen that conversation with Professors Bradshaw and Swinburne, hosted by Rob Saylor, be sure to check that out here on IOTA's YouTube channel. So that, I think, takes care of introductions, and welcome, Dr. Bradshaw. We're so happy that you are joining us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Great to be here.
Awesome. Let's just set the scene. Let's just begin at the beginning. For those of us who might not be so familiar with these very old and very talked about and written about ideas, can you walk us through the basics? What is the concept of divine energy and this question of the essence energies distinction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's often thought of as a distinctive feature of Orthodox theology. Within Western circles, the essence energies distinction was sort of popularized by Vladimir Lossky, and after him, Father John Meyendorff, Bishop Callistos Ware, and others, back in the 40s, 50s, middle of the 20th century. But they focused primarily on St. Gregory Palamas, and that's the association that a lot of people have with the idea of divine energy, essence energies distinction, was that that's a distinctive teaching of Gregory Palamas. And it is in a sense, but that's only because at that point it entered into explicit controversy. It really was, it runs throughout the whole Greek patristic tradition. And one thing I argue in the book is that it really goes back to the New Testament, because you can find the word energia, and that's the source of our word energy. Already in the writings of St. Paul, he uses that word or cognate terms about 24 times. So it's actually pretty prominent. And what I argue is that if you look at the meaning of that term in St. Paul, in most English translations, it's typically translated as working or operation. And that's fine in many cases, but there are at least some passages where it's really more accurate to understand him already as referring to a divine energy. In Colossians, when he's referring to himself and his ministry, he refers to the energia of God that is being energumenein, and that's the verb cognate to energia. It's here in the passive voice, and it means being realized or made effective within him and his ministry. So he sees the divine energy at work in his ministry, in his own life, also in the church. And another great passage on that is 1 Corinthians 12, when he talks about the gifts of the Spirit. Those two he describes in terms of what the Holy Spirit energe, or performs, realizes and makes effective within those who receive these gifts. And later fathers like St. Basil refer to the gifts of the Spirit as divine energies. And that becomes common terminology in the whole Greek patristic tradition. So it definitely didn't begin with Gregory Palamas in the 14th century. And one reason I wrote the essays that are in this book, and some of them sort of following on from my earlier book, Aristotle, East and West, where I also examined the whole history of this concept, is that it's something that's been missing from Western Christianity. I don't say that in order to make a polemical point, arguing for orthodoxy against any other form of Christian faith. That's not really the purpose here. The purpose is just to try to recover the fullness of the Christian faith as it's taught in the New Testament and as it was passed down to us from the early church. And I think that a concept of the divine energy is really central to that.
Within the context of Eastern Christianity, you mentioned Lasky, Meyendorff, Bishop Kallistos. How did they write about it, and how does your book? Can you explain to us a little bit the impetus to writing the book in conversation with some of those modern Orthodox theologians?
Yeah, well, because they're kind of starting with Gregory Palamas, they understand the divine energy largely in terms of the uncreated light. And that's a central issue in the Hesychus controversy that Palamas was engaged in. He was defending the Hesychus, who had these experiences of a light that would surround them and even sort of infuse them. They themselves would sometimes become radiant with this light while they were practicing the Jesus prayer. And Barlam, who was their great critic, attacked this whole idea and said that's blasphemous if you're thinking that that light is any more than just something created by God. And the monks on Mount Athos definitely thought it was more than that. They thought that they were experiencing God within this light, and that's why they called it uncreated, right? An uncreated light. And Gregory Palamas identifies that light with the light that shone around Christ at the Transfiguration. And he takes that as sort of the paradigm of the uncreated light. And he says that that light is eternal. And Christ himself refers to, the glory when he prays to the Father in John 17, the glory that I had with you before the world was. And how in that prayer he wants to share that glory now with his disciples. So for Palamas and the Hesychus, the uncreated light is something that's visible and can be experienced in this life through the Jesus prayer and everything that goes with that. Obviously, the ascetic life of the monks, a life of obedience, and so forth. And that I think is entirely correct and legitimate, but it's not the only meaning or only application of the concept of the divine energy. And even when you read Palamas, he does, as he quotes from earlier fathers like St. Basil or St. Maximus is another major source here, he draws from them the ways that they refer to the divine energy that really don't have much to do with the uncreated light. For instance, St. Basil has a famous passage in his epistle 234 where he refers to the divine energies as God's providence and wisdom and foreknowledge, his bestowal of rewards and punishments. And he says these energies come down to us while his essence remains beyond our reach. And so for St. Basil, the energies are God insofar as he is active and knowable and present, whereas the divine essence is their source. But as their source, if the energies are God as he is knowable and present, the essence as their source is going to be God as he is beyond knowing and sort of transcends any material apprehension, or I should say created apprehension, because it's true even for the angels that they don't apprehend the divine essence. So you already have that theme in the background in the church fathers. And if you look at the larger picture, the divine energy as the uncreated light is just one form of that. It's one way in which God is manifest and present. And that's really what Gregory Palamas goes on to elucidate as he goes further, beyond just discussing the experience of the Hesychus, and he gets into the idea of the divine energy in its own right, more toward the end of the triads. He also draws on what St. Maximus taught about the divine logoi, sort of the words, the acts of speech that accompany each creature. St. Maximus says that those who are purified can sort of hear the divine logoi within creatures. They can hear what God utters in creating each individual being, and that utterance is the meaning, the purpose that he has for that being, and that includes us, but it also includes all of creation all around us. So for him, this is a way of experiencing God within the created world. It's what he refers to as natural contemplation, the contemplation of God within nature. And Maximus does not call the logoi energies, but they are acts that God performs. They're acts of will. That's how he defines them, divine and good acts of will. And so, since acts are forms of energia, activity, and the will itself, the divine will, is regularly identified in the Fathers as a form of the divine energia, again, activity or energy. Polemos kind of puts those pieces together and says, well, the logoi as acts of will are also forms of the divine energy. And that, so for him, that's another way in which God can be known and directly experienced within creation. So what he really does is sort of a great act of synthesis, where he's drawing together what you can find treated somewhat separately already in the New Testament, in the early fathers and the Cappadocians and St. Maximus. And it's only when you get to Polemos that someone really sort of stands back and draws that all together under a single comprehensive term of energia. Um, anyway, that's, I think Meyendorff and Losky did wonderful work, but because of their historical focus, and really their goal was, I think, largely to explicate what's distinctively Orthodox. And my goal is almost the opposite of that. It's to explicate what's universally Christian here. What Protestants and Catholics, I think there's no reason they can't embrace this teaching. And I think that as they do so, they'll find, it reestablishes a depth of connection with early Christianity that's largely been lost often in the West. And I think that's very important.
So to kind of keep exploring along those lines, you've alluded to it a little bit with your references to Paul, but you mentioned this as a teaching that Christians can consider and perhaps accept sort of in an ecumenical way. But how would you wrestle with or respond to this idea that these sort of systematized explanations, teachings, discussions are in the end rereading a much later idea? I mean, you've told us how actually you see it as being an idea that's been developing for a long time, but in terms of its actual kind of scriptural basis, how do you wrestle with these sort of highly articulated ideas that become articulated and talked about more and more later? How are we not just sort of rereading that into scripture?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me say, first of all, there is an essay in the book, The Divine Energies in the New Testament. You notice I don't refer to the essence energies distinction in the New Testament because the distinction itself is not there. The concept of essence, the Greek word ousia, doesn't really play any role in the New Testament. Whereas that term energia does. It's very prominent, like I mentioned. So my claim is only that the concept of the divine energy is present in the New Testament. I think the essence energies distinction emerges later, more in the 4th century during the Trinitarian debates. So far as what I say about the New Testament, I'm open to any criticism or objections. I think it's an issue that really has to be decided by careful philological study of the meaning of that word group as it's used by St. Paul. And what I do in that article is to argue that there has been a mistake in translation that has been pervasive throughout pretty much all Western languages. And it goes back to the original Latin translation of the New Testament. Even before St. Jerome did the Vulgate, there was what's called the Vetus Latina, the Old Latin translation that was done anonymously in probably the 3rd century AD. Jerome in the Vulgate just takes over the translation of Paul's epistles that already existed in the Vetus Latina. So this was not his work. This was done by people we don't even know, quite early historically. And as they sought to translate that word group out of St. Paul, again, the noun energia, the verb energein, and the passive form of that verb energesthai, they didn't really have a very good Latin equivalent. The noun they chose was operatio, and that's why energia in Western translations is often translated as operation or working. The verb that corresponds to that is operatur, which is a deponent. Okay, and these are very common in Latin. That's a verb that has only passive grammatical forms, but is active in meaning. And so the problem with that is that you have only these passive verbal forms, and you're trying to translate a verb that has both active and passive forms. And so there's really no way you can capture that difference. And if you look at how that verb is translated in the Vetus Latina and in the Vulgate, it simply obscures the difference between the active and the passive uses of energein. And if you do that, what happens is that you lose this very important fact about St. Paul's usage, that Paul reserves this word group only for supernatural agents, God, the Holy Spirit, Christ, and even Satan. He refers to the energy of Satan as well in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But if you miss the fact that he's using the verb in the passive, then it looks like there are all kinds of subjects to whom he's attributing that action. And there really aren't. It's just a case of mistranslation. But it became a pervasive mistranslation that you can find, like I said, in all Western languages up till the present day. It's not been corrected. In the article, I go through some of the scholarship on this, and I point out that you can find Western biblical scholars in the early 20th century who are already aware of this problem, and we're drawing attention to the fact that energesthai in the New Testament is passive, and it should be translated that way, and this makes a big difference to the overall interpretation. And they were largely ignored. And so there's been a real lag in a New Testament scholarship catching up with good philology, just basic Greek philology. And so I really want to draw attention to that. And like I said, if you understand that correctly, if you understand that the concept of divine energy is in the New Testament, then the whole subsequent history of its use in the Fathers looks very different. And you see a lot of continuity there, and a lot of what the Fathers go on to say just seems much more natural of an outgrowth from biblical Christianity than it would otherwise.
Your job as a philosopher is to get curious about these conversations that have been had over the centuries. It's to get curious about, okay, we're going to go back to scripture. It's to get philologically curious. How would you say this conversation, which matters so much in your field and within the broader theological kind of academic discourse, but how can we think of this sort of as everyday people with liturgical lives in the church? How might you see this work that you have gathered together in this volume influencing, mattering, enlivening, even perhaps someone's own kind of everyday experience, either in the world or liturgically?
I think the model of St. Paul is very important for all Christians. Like I mentioned earlier, the verse in Colossians where he refers to the energy of God that's being realized and made effective within him as he pursues this very difficult work of spreading the gospel. I mean, difficult really is an understatement, right? He was persecuted, he was in shipwreck, he was imprisoned. Ultimately, he was executed, all for the sake of the gospel. And for him, that was the realization of God's own energy and activity and purpose through his own life, through the choices he made and the actions he performed. So the key idea that I think you see there is what theologians refer to as synergy. And synergy, you can translate that literally as cooperation, the sharing of energy or activity. But cooperation in English typically means two independent agents who work together, like you and I are cooperating on this interview right now. Synergy is a lot more than that. It's God as you might say, the primal, original active agent, acting within us in a way that imparts to us the energy to perform his commands and to realize his will. And in doing so, he's not making us puppets. He's not just sort of treating us as passive recipients of this energy that he's zapping into us. Not at all. I mean, you go back to St. Paul, everything he does is a passionate expression of his own personality and his own energy. So what really happens here is that God's energy enables us to be the persons that we're meant to be. And it enables us to act fully and authentically as ourselves. And one of the points I think that's very interesting about St. Paul, when the light shines upon him on the road to Damascus, and Christ speaks to him out of that light, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He says something interesting then. He says, it is hard for you to kick against the pricks. The pricks, of course, being sort of the spurs that a rider wears to direct a horse. And what that tells you is that Saul has been resisting God within his own heart. He has known at some level, God has been trying to tell him that you shouldn't be doing what you're doing, that persecuting these Christians is not my will for you. And he's been kicking against the pricks. And I think if you take that into account, you have to see Paul's whole life as after that moment, when he does become a Christian, now he's really himself. Now he's really acting as himself fully and authentically in a way that he wasn't before. And I think that's what God offers to all of us. And that's why, that to partake of the divine energy, in a sense, it's just a way of describing the whole Christian life. And that's another reason that I think it's a mistake to sort of start with the 14th century, as if the idea originates then. It didn't. That just becomes the predominant term that was used. But in the New Testament, it's already there, and it's already being used in this way to describe that intimate relationship of God active and effective within us in a way that enables us to be who we really are. And that's something that I think every Christian, is deeply concerned. Every human being, I think it's safe to say, is really deeply concerned with how can I be the person I'm meant to be, the person who I truly am, and not just a sham or an imposter going through life. And if you turn to St. Paul, I think you find the answer to that.
Your book is an exploratory progression of sorts. It brings together essays you describe that seem to have sort of been written throughout your career. You make a note in the book. You said my thinking is sort of in progress, and you address some thinking in the afterword there about how you're continuing to think about reformulating your ideas on the topic of divine energy and this essence's distinction. Curious, in light of the broader conversation, where have you landed in a nutshell? Maybe describe to us where you've landed and why you chose to kind of keep the essays that you've left as is along the way in this volume.
Yeah. So one thing that I think I didn't do sufficiently either in my earlier book or these essays, or most of these essays until the last one at the very end, is ask this hard question: what exactly do the fathers have in mind when they use that term divine ousia, the divine essence? I mean, this is a very familiar term. Every time we recite the creed, we say, I believe, of one essence with the Father, homoousion, of the same ousia with the Father. So it's a central term for belief in the Trinity. And they use it all over the place, but it's hard to define. I mean, and you might say, well, of course you can't define the term, right? You cannot define the divine essence, but you should be able to say, what do they mean by that word? And I really never did face that question directly as I should have. And one thing that I think drove me to it ultimately was realizing that the way that the essence energies distinction has often been formulated, and in fact, the way I did earlier when I was referring to St. Basil, his epistle, where he talks about the energies come down to us, but the essence remains beyond our reach. So one way that people formulate this idea is to say that, well, the divine energies are God as he is knowable and accessible and can be, the divine life can be shared by creatures. And the divine ousia is God as he is unknowable. So one wrinkle with that is this concept of what are called the natural energies that becomes prominent, particularly in the 7th century with St. Maximus. It doesn't originate there, but Ultimately, it's mentioned in actually the Acts of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, where they affirm that Christ had both a human and a divine natural energy. And then it's picked up by Gregory Palamas, and he uses it not only in the singular, as the council did, but also in the plural to refer to the natural energies of God as what we would in the West often call divine attributes like wisdom, power, goodness. And those are energies in the sense that they are intrinsic to God, and then they're then manifested through particular ways of divine action. So God's goodness could be manifested in really an infinite number of ways, but it is manifested in the particular ways that he acts within the actual world that he's made. But his goodness is prior to that. His goodness is already present within him as what Palamas calls divine natural energy. And if you bear that in mind, then to say that the energies are God as he comes down to us is a little too simple, because the energies are actually already there present in God, even prior to, independently of the act of creation or any creature knowing God in any way. They're already there as these natural energies that are simply manifested. So I wanted to do more justice to that. While the thing that's tricky there is, well, if we know all these natural energies, goodness, wisdom, power, unity, and so on, love, then how is it that we don't know the divine essence? What's the relationship between the natural energies and the essence? Well, so what I do in the last chapter of the book, it's a new paper that I wrote. I developed the model of a computer program, or the analogy of a computer program. This may be a little awkward because God is not a computer. I'm not in any way suggesting that. I'm not suggesting the divine essence is a program. Obviously, that would be absurd. But computer programs are the best case that we have in our own experience of something that is active and manifests itself in potentially an infinite number of ways. And it's manifesting, in so doing, it's manifesting characteristics that it has that we can know while we never actually know the program. All right. To know the program, you have to be a professional programmer. You have to know that language. And for most programs, they're so long that in many cases, there's no single human being who has even read the whole thing, much less is able to keep it all in mind at one time, right? A lot of programs like the one we're using now, Zoom, if you were to look at the code of Zoom, it would be vast. And it would have great numbers of subprograms and little, modules and so forth that have been written at different times by different programmers. I don't have to know any of that to be able to interact with it effectively. And in fact, I can also know many characteristics that it does have. I know that it is a video program. I know that that Zoom interviews can be recorded, right? I know they can involve multiple people. I know that they can go for a certain length of time. I know a lot about Zoom. I have no idea about what its program is. I don't know the essence of Zoom. I know its natural energies, the fact that it's a video program, that it can do X, Y, and Z. And thereby I'm able to engage it and interact with it, and to know it experientially, you might say, through that interaction. Now, that's a very weak analogy for God. God is vastly greater than any program. But I think it brings home this point about human thought and language, that we're able to speak of and refer to a reality that we're incapable of knowing as it actually is at that highest, most deepest level. In the case of a computer program, is the actual code, right? We're totally unable to know that, yet we can know it in a different way and interact with it. So that's the analogy I try to develop, and that's what I think really they're referring to when they use that word ousia. They're referring to that unknowable, highest, deepest source of what God is. Whereas the natural energies are analogous to things like being a video program, accepting input in English, making input that or output that can be recorded, et cetera. Those are sort of the surface level properties that can be known, and they're true and they're real and they're important, but they're not the essence itself.
I wonder, just by way of conclusion, if you can give us just a few thoughts on what it was like to kind of put this book together, sort of just from a functional. This is one of IOTA Publications' second big projects. What did it take? You were pulling on a lot of your work from over your career. What was it like putting the book together?
Yeah, well, so I will say, if any other scholars are interested in working with IOTA, it really is as easy as I think any academic publisher I've ever dealt with. Um, Paul Gavrilik was an enormous help. He was really inspiration for the whole book. He proofread it himself. He made wonderful suggestions along the way. Erica Zabinski did the typesetting, and was also just a pleasure to work with. And as you know, the IOTA folks helped me find, I think, a lovely cover. This is St. Peter raising Tabitha, and I chose that as kind of an example of the divine energy at work in the New Testament.
Hmm.
So it's a great experience. And on top of all that, they bring it out at a very affordable price, $29.95, and in a very timely fashion. It was less than a year between the completion of the manuscript and the publication of the book. Just could not have better experience with IOTA.
Neat. Dr. Bradshaw, thank you so much for sharing. If I want to tell our viewers, if ideas from this conversation intrigue you, perturb you, anywhere in between those two, do check out the volume. I believe it is available still for sale, an easy click on Amazon, or visit our website. And Dr. Bradshaw, thanks a ton for chatting with us today.
Well, thank you, Marika. It's been a pleasure.